Hey guys, sorry this is taking me so long to upload. It's taken a lot of tries, and hopefully this time's the charm. So, my dangerous idea that I'm going to talk about today is ethnic nationalism. First off, though, I'd like to talk about what makes an idea dangerous in political science. What it's not is whether it's controversial, because basically everybody has a bone to pick with each other and each other's ideas in political science. Kind of like philosophy. What it actually is, though, or what a dangerous idea actually is something that poses potential harm to macro systems like economies and geopolitical security, and also the individual people who those effects are going to trickle down to. So, the field that I'm going to talk about today is nationalism and ethnic conflict, which is strangely a new field in political science. There hasn't been many people talking about it because it's not so much an ideology as much as it is something that political scientists actually have a hard time articulating and identifying. But today I'm going to tackle that in 10 minutes, so hopefully you guys will be able to capture this to some degree. Okay, so what is it? What is ethnic nationalism? So, first off, what it's not is nationalism as a whole. There are other types of nationalism, and to go more basic, the nation is a group of people that are bonded together through some ties of language, ethnicity, civic values, or democratic system. So, for instance, the United States is more of a civic democracy or a civic nationalism on paper because it's supposed to be values that bind us together, even though there are racial disparities in wealth and in the justice system. Now, the problem with ethnic nationalism is that it is blatantly not about values. It is about ethnic markers like the color of your skin, or the language that you speak, or just whatever group you identify with that either puts you in a group or outside of a group. The obvious problem with this is that means that the boundaries of that group are going to be very rigid, and it's automatically going to exclude certain others. There are leaders that you guys can probably think of that follow this ethnic nationalist brand popping up all over. One of them is President Trump, but there's other examples too. The man standing next to President Trump is Viktor Orban of Hungary, who was just granted unlimited emergency powers during the coronavirus epidemic. Jair Bolsonaro on the top right, leader of Brazil, basically oppresses the indigenous peoples of the Amazon and encourages logging companies to go in and tear up the Amazon. On the bottom right is Rodrigo Duterte of the Philippines, who is waging a war on not only drug distributors, but drug users, and has also encouraged ethnically nationalist policies in his own country. So we have two really awesome people in this slide. I'm with Obi-Wan in saying that my allegiance is to democracy, but so should everyone's, right? But that's not really the case, because just like Francis Fukuyama found out the hard way, the guy in the top left, we're not really at what he called the end of history, or, quote, the end point of man's ideological evolution and the universalization of Western liberal democracy. We've had 2 decades since the Cold War of trade liberalization and globalization, but now, in the last 5 years or so, we've had enormous populist blowback from far right-wing movements that are trying to take back nationalist control and sovereignty from a globalizing movement that had taken control since the end of the Cold War. So this stuff's kind of abstract, right? So why does it even matter? Well, for one thing, we're all in quarantine right now, in part because some national leaders struggled with how to respond effectively to the coronavirus. Instead of identifying the global community, Xi Jinping and the Chinese Communist Party withheld that information. And what that led to was a faster and more dangerous spread of the coronavirus that countries were not prepared for. There's also a refugee crisis that just really blew up in 2015. If you guys remember the images that were swirling around online of people on boats, children drowned in the water. Terrible situation. But I also dislike the term that I wrote here, which is the refugee crisis, because it's not really a crisis of the refugees, but a crisis of ethnic conflict and governments being unwilling to accommodate people within their own community that don't look like them. Again, an example of ethnic nationalism. Think of Syria in the Civil War and how so many people are being pushed out there. Or, for instance, Turkey and how refugees are being pushed away nowadays from Turkey, or even President Trump, who slashed the refugee quota to its lowest ever. So, is there hope? Absolutely, but we got to know how we got here, and we've got to know what has worked and what hasn't in other crises. In 2008, we got out of a horrible crisis, financial one, because we worked together across party lines within the United States and with global actors to achieve some economic stability. However, that's not happening right now. There is a moderate amount of bipartisan consensus, but President Trump has actually turned away WHO ventilators, donations from China and other globalized institutions just because it doesn't match his America First model. That doesn't work according to 2008 or 1929 examples of what didn't work economically or even in pandemics like the 1918 Spanish flu. Harris Malonis is the guy that I'm reading right now, and he says that there's not enough study of why it is or what incentives there are that cause elites like President Trump to do what they do. And he says there are really three solutions, some better than others, obviously, to mitigating ethnic conflict and creating a nation within boundaries. One is accommodation, which is basically like the previous example. Let's see if I can go back to that slide here of the Åland Islands that have a Swedish national identity but belong to the jurisdiction of Finland. Because of political accommodations that were granted to the Åland Islands, they're willing to stay with Finland. So that's a good example of how to mitigate ethnic conflict. There's assimilation, which is nowhere near as good. That involves governments taking children from their parents and sending them to boarding schools. Think of Native Americans in the early United States. Finally, there's exclusion, which is the worst of these three options, which involves deportations and genocide. And so these three options exist because of what Harris Malonis says are geopolitical game playing. And as long as there is geopolitical conflict from the outside, there will be ethnic conflict on the inside. The United States can do better by not having such a nationalist standpoint, economically or ethnically. And as long as we don't look at the world through America First goggles, we'll actually be able to better solve problems like the coronavirus, like economic volatility, and we'll be able to just do better overall. So this lacks a lot of nuance because I've only had about 8 minutes to sum it all up, but I'd be interested in hearing your guys' ideas of how this could apply to your fields, because I think the ideas are pretty abstract and have a broad reach to things that touch the rest of our lives. So thank you for listening to my TED Talk.